So good afternoon everyone. In this presentation I'm going to talk about documentation with RAML. And by the way, the beautiful picture on the right was taken not far from here at Lake Tahoe when the skies were clear. My name is Shai Mesisterano. I'm a full stack developer. I'm currently consulting for Node.js and React projects. I worked with RAML on my last project, and I wanted to share my experience with this great tool. As a developer, I love testing. I think that tests are great for documentation. I usually use the given when then form as a description, and then a documentation is generated. For example, given a user, when they click on a button, then a message should show up. But then I ask myself, what is a user? What is a message? Where these things are defined. RAML allowed me to define what a user is, what a message is, and to document all the relevant details. When I define a user, for example, using RAML, that definition will apply to the entire application. I was excited to find such a powerful tool. With RAML, the documentation writes itself. Let's begin with the motivation in terms of growth and sustainability. Open source projects are made to be contributed, and documentation is the key to that. Documentation is the first place where contributors can find information on how to contribute to the project. Documentation is also important because it is the showcase of our project. The quality of our documentation affects how other developers and organizations perceive us. A modern API encapsulates all the technical use cases, and the documentation must be done properly in order to describe it and what its capabilities are. Now let's think about the following demonstration. Imagine that you bought a brand new microwave. You get a manual or a documentation. Anyone of you is actually reading the manual when they buy, for example, a microwave? No. Okay, so for those of you who don't read the manual, please imagine that you bought a rocket ship. Although I'm not sure it comes with a manual. So what are the most important aspects in a documentation which are considered as good? I would suggest the following. A proper documentation should be clear. We should know what input the microwave expects to receive with no room for doubts and no missing information. For example, we should enter the cooking time before we start cooking. Consistent. The terminology should be consistent. The button that starts the cooking should always be named start, not cook or the button on the left. Organized, it should be well structured to allow quick access to what is needed. Versioned, it should match the model that we bought. And with examples, because sometimes we just want to see how things are used. Now, let's talk about open source projects. These parameters are crucial for any documentation, whether it is an electronic device, an internal API, or a public API. Let's talk about APIs and their documentation, and specifically about RAML, a great tool which makes our lives easy as we build our API and document it. We'll see how RAML may help us with achieving these goals and makes our documentation clear, consistent, organized, versioned, and with examples. RAML stands for RESTful API Modeling Language. It is a description language. It is a simple way of describing REST APIs. API description can include a list of endpoints, model names, their types, like for example, integer or boolean, set of rules, for example, if a certain model is required. RAML files are structured, and we can use inheritance to prevent repetitions. The project was first proposed in 2013 as an open source tool. It is a superset of YAML, which means that it is optimized for readability, unlike JSON, for example. No installation is required. Your favorite code editor should be good enough to create and edit RAML files. RAML can generate anything since it is just a format. But in order to do that, we need to install some generators. I will talk about some of these generators later. RAML makes it easy to create documentations. With RAML, the documentation can be generated and published according to the API specification. As a result, both API and documentation are created at the same time. When we specify our API, we effectively create a documentation without even knowing about it. And in a bit, we will see a demo of this magic. Then all we need to do is to publish the generated documentation using FTP or CI/CD tools. And now for the demo. The API that we are going to create is basically a way to vote for the best Linux distribution. I see a lot of Facebook posts with the question, what is the best Linux distro? So this API will allow us to put in our vote. I'm going to use VS Code as my code editor. Okay, so let's write our first RAML file, our first example. So the first thing that we need to do is to define the version of RAML. In this case, it will be 1.0. And then we need to provide a title for our API. In this case, it's the best Linux distribution API. Next, we are going to define the base URI. For example, best.distro, and the version of this API. Now, let's define our first endpoint. So in RESTful APIs, we need to define endpoint and then to access it with methods like get, post, put, etc. So the endpoint that I'm going to create will be distributions, and it will return a list of distributions. So I can define a get method for this endpoint and to define which responses I expect to receive. In this case, I will define a 200 success response with the following body. Its type is application JSON, and I can provide examples for valid responses. For example, Ubuntu with this version and Linux Mint. So this is it. This is the first example. This is a valid API specification. It has one endpoint, distributions, and a single method, get. And this part of the examples is so important because when we want to test our API, usually we do it with a mock server. So we need the server to respond with some example. So in this case, it will return the examples that I highlighted in the code. So all we need to do at this point is to use a generator. As I mentioned before, we need to use generators to make this format, this plain text file, to a visual output. So the way to do that is to install a generator. One popular generator is RAML to HTML. It will take this file, this RAML file, and create a documentation for us, an HTML documentation. So I installed this tool before, and now what I can do, I can use this tool to generate the documentation. I need to provide the path to the RAML file, and this will generate an HTML file, and I can redirect it to a file that will be created, an HTML file. So documentation.html. Now that the file is generated, this is the result, and of course I can open it with a live server, and this is our API. So this is the title that we defined before. This is the version of this API, the base URI, and currently it includes only a single endpoint, which is distribution. And if I click on get, I will be able to see the status code that will be returned, and the examples for this endpoint. Now let's move on to the second example. So again, I'm defining the RAML version and the title of our API, and of course the base URI, the version as before, but now I will add some description sections. For example, I want to describe my API. So the description of this API is a voting system for the best Linux distribution. And I can also add a documentation section that will appear both in our generated files and in tools like Swagger or Postman. So in this case, I will create two sections of documentation, and I can use the Markdown syntax to add some links and to format our documentation. So this is the authentication, for example, section, which is part of the documentation, and that's it. So this is the top part is the description of our API, and now let's define the endpoint. So we have a single endpoint, again, distributions, and now I can add a description to this endpoint, which will be a collection of distributions, and it will have the get method supported, and of course I can describe the get method again. So all these descriptions that I add will appear later in the UI, in the HTML file. So the rest of the file will be the same as before, with some examples that we can see later on the documentation. And I will also add a post method, and of course describe it for the documentation, and it will request the creation of a new distribution. And the body will be of type application JSON with the following properties. Name, the name of the distribution. It will be of type string, and the version of the distribution, which will be of type pattern, because I want to use regular expression to allow dot notation. And some examples, again, for the documentation and also for the mock data that we can use in order to test our API. So in this case, I create two examples, one for Fedora and one for Arch. And as before, I add a response, 204, describe it for the documentation. This distribution was created successfully, and this is it. This is the file. We added some documentation aspects to it. For example, the description of the API, and a documentation section. We'll see in a bit how it looks like, and a single endpoint which supports get and post. For each of them, I included some examples that I can use later on. So let's see how it looks like, this RAML file. So I will open again a live server, and you can see that all the descriptions and documentation sections appear here, and the Markdown is supported, so I can click on this link and go to another page. And here the authentication section explains how to use API keys as an example. And this is the description of the endpoint. And here we can see that it supports two methods. One is for getting all the distributions, it will be this one. And the other one will be responsible for creation of a new distribution. Now for the last example, and here we can see a really powerful aspect of RAML. So let's write our code. Again, we define the title of our API, base URI, and this time I will add a dynamic version, because in reality we publish different kinds of documentations with different versions, and RAML supports it. It means that the version that that is described at line 4 will be included here instead of this placeholder. Again, the description of our API. And for the documentation section, I will use RAML's ability to include external files. So the documentation will include 2 entries, which redirects to other files. The legal documentation was stored in this file, legal.raml, and authentication in authentication.raml. We can see these files here. So this is the authentication.raml. It's just copy-paste of the previous version that we did in our last example. And the legal section, again, copy-paste, but we externalized our files and we can reuse them in that way. I can also define some types. For example, the distribution type will be of type object, and it will include 2 fields. The first one is name, which is string, and the other one is pattern. And I will add another type, a vote, which will represent a vote for the best Linux distro. This one will have 2 properties. The first one is distribution name of type string, and total, which is number, which represents the total number of votes for this specific distribution. I can also set it as not required. By default, RAML set all the types as required, but if I want to make it optional, I can do the following: required and false. And the reason for that is that when we get a vote, then we want to get it together with the total number of votes. And when we create a vote, when we vote for a distribution, we don't want to provide the total field. So this is how we can make the total field optional. I can also describe a resource type. Again, it is externalized, it's in another file. And this is how I can make the API specification modular. I can take all the get, post definitions that were before and just put them in another file and reuse the same definitions again and again. Let's see how a resource type looks like. So the description, for example, doesn't include any specific term. So it says collection of something, and that something will be the endpoint name. So it's modular. I can pass some parameters, as we are doing with functions, and it will be included in this collection. Another thing that I can do, I can pipe to a function to make, for example, the resource path name singular. So, for example, votes will become vote, and distributions will become distribution. So this is a modular file. It includes the definitions that we saw before, but it is, again, modular. This is the important thing about it. It means that now we don't need to specify the methods for the distributions endpoint. All we need to do is to pass parameters to this collection, and then the collection will parse the endpoint details. So as you can see, I just pass some samples, and also the votes will use the same structure. So distributions collection accepts example success, which you can find here, and it will be pasted. It will be included instead of this placeholder, and the examples post body will be included here instead of this placeholder. And the nice thing about it is that when we create the votes endpoint, we can do the same. We can pass example success and examples post body, and the collection will parse the relevant details. For votes, it will make the term singular and use the type vote, which we defined here. So let's see how this documentation looks like. So this is the final example, and let's see the result. So it contains 2 endpoints and description of the supported methods, and of course the examples for each endpoint. And we can see a fully blown documentation that I downloaded from the web, and see how it looks like. So this documentation includes the documentation section, and you see examples here, and we can also define a placeholder for the RESTful API. And if we want to apply some security features, we can describe these security features, and everything is very clear to the user. What should be provided, what should be required or not. And if we would like to change the style of our documentation, we can use a theme if we want it to look a little bit different. So we can pass a flag. This one, for example, will generate another style.html. This will be the result, and the input for that will be the second example. And let's see how it looks like. So this is a little bit more modern look and feel for a documentation. Again, the source is the same RAML file, and this is what makes this tool such a powerful tool, because you just write a plain text and you can do whatever you want with this text. So you can click on these examples and you can navigate and basically to do whatever you want with the RAML file. Another thing that you can do, you can import it to Postman. So all you need to do is to import the RAML file, and Postman supports RAML files, and it will be included in Postman's UI, and you will be able to perform requests and see the responses. And of course, the documentation section appears on the right side of the screen. It's the same documentation that we wrote before. Okay. So regarding the question, what is the best Linux distro? I personally feel lucky to live in a world where I can test free software and then decide what to use. So thank you, open source community. I also asked DALL-E to make a picture of what is the best Linux distribution, and this is what I got. So it looks like Tax is pretty lost, but he's pointing his nose towards the blue distribution, so I guess that this is what he wants on his laptop. Let's review the capabilities that we saw in the demo. All we did is defining some constraints. For example, distribution name is a string. We can also define a required field. In addition to the structured data, which is generated automatically, RAML allows us to describe anything we want in our own words. It accepts Markdown. As you can see in this example, in the documentation, it supports Markdown to add titles, links, code blocks, and more. We can refer to external files, and by that remove all the definitions outside of the HTML, the RAML file. And we keep it short and readable that way. Samples can be externalized as well, as you can see here. If we want to localize our documentation, we can create several files, each one in a different language, and include it in the RAML file during build time. We can write a placeholder on the resource type to be filled with a value specified on the resource, with a placeholder receiving different words depending on the resource. We can use pipes, for example, to convert a singular form. We can deploy our documentation to different folders, and by that, keep previous documentations available. Or we might prefer to keep the API version synced with our application version by injecting the Git tag into the version field. Tracking changes is available via source control. For example, if we are using git blame, we can see who wrote the documentation, who changed it, when, why it happened. We can revert the change, and all the relevant people in the organization are notified. Now, let's conclude how RAML makes it easy to create proper documentation. Clear, methods, locations, field names, and types, we know what to pass. Consistent, with reusable definitions, the terminology is consistent. Organized, since RAML is a language, we enjoy well-structured data that reflects on how the end result looks like. For example, the generated HTML file contains a list of endpoints with details about each endpoint. Versioned, the version field is the only indicator, and with Git we can see the revision history. With examples, we can provide code samples so users can see how things are used. For example, in an HTML page, interactive RESTful API console, a local server, etc. Since RAML is an open source project and it is just a format, we can generate any visual or logical representation of the data. We can use our creativity and implement our own idea based on the specification. When we start a new project, we usually begin with defining the models. Many times the next step is creating the database or start writing the code. You might want to consider specify your API first using RAML, or to create a RAML specification based on your current implementation. When RAML is at the core of your project, you can use it as a dictionary between terms and the desired behavior. Together with tests, this allows you to build a strong backbone for your project. In my last project, we spinned up a server in our local environment. We created JavaScript mocks by generating a JSON file and use it as a JavaScript object. We used the mocks in our test. We also generated TypeScript types out of the RAML file. We generated Go modules based on the specification, and of course we generated a documentation. If I could draw a line between the things in a project that are related to documents and things that are related to code, I would place RAML right in the middle. RAML is between writing documentations, since it is a document with definitions, and code generation of API, tests, mocks, and more. So documentation made easy with RAML. What are the principles? Write once, use many, multiple programming languages, multiple output formats. We don't need to synchronize the documentation manually. Single source of truth. The documentation is managed in a single place, the source code. If the code doesn't work, the documentation doesn't get updated. Keeping it dry, don't repeat yourself, with reusable definitions, resource types, samples. It is written by the developers, the people who know the best what is going on. And it is backed by open source projects. As I said before, we can test free software. So go ahead, try RAML. Feel free to reach out. This is my LinkedIn. Thank you so much for listening.